The old house on Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, stood quietly, under the watchful gaze of the moon. It had been years since the house last echoed with life, yet its reputation had never faded. Locals whispered about the horrors that took place inside, the DeFeo family murders, and the strange events that followed when the Lutz family briefly made it their home. Most people avoided the place, yet something about it always drew the curious and the brave. The newest occupants were the Morris family, who had just moved in after a long search for their dream home. Joe Morris, a pragmatic man who didn't believe in ghosts, got the house for a steal. He didn't care about the house's dark past. To him, it was just a story to scare off potential buyers. His wife, Susan, was a bit more hesitant, but their children, 12-year-old Emma and 9-year-old Ben, were thrilled by the idea of living in a house with a spooky history. The first night was uneventful, but strange things began happening as the days passed. Emma was the first to notice. It started small, creaks and groans in the middle of the night, doors shutting on their own, and the faint sound of whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She tried to tell her parents, but Joe laughed it off, explaining that old houses made noises, and the wind could cause doors to move. Susan, though uneasy, tried to brush it aside as well. But it wasn't just Emma. Ben, who was usually full of energy, started to change. He became quiet, withdrawn. He stopped playing outside and spent most of his time sitting in the corner of his room, staring at the wall. One night, Susan found him whispering softly to someone who wasn't there. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice shaky. Ben turned to her, his eyes distant. "The boy who lives in my room." Susan's blood ran cold. "What boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says he used to live here," Ben replied. "He wants to play, but he's mad because we're in his house now." The next morning, Susan confronted Joe. "Something isn't right here," she said. "The kids are acting strange. Emma won't go near the basement, and Ben is talking to someone who doesn't exist." Joe sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's just their imagination. This place has a reputation, and they're feeding off it." But Susan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just childish imagination. That night, she lay awake, listening to the house around her. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, the kind that weighed on your chest and made it hard to breathe. She was just about to drift off when she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. She sat up, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow and deliberate, like someone or something was knocking from the inside of the walls. Susan's heart raced as she reached for Joe, shaking him awake. "Joe, do you hear that?" He groaned, annoyed at being woken up. "It's probably the pipes." "It's not the pipes," Susan insisted. "It's coming from inside the walls." Joe grumbled as he got out of bed, muttering something about overactive imaginations. But as he stepped into the hallway, the sound grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Joe froze. The noise was coming from Ben's room. He rushed in, flicking on the light. Ben was fast asleep, curled up in his bed, but the tapping continued. Joe's eyes darted around the room, trying to locate the source. That's when he saw it. The closet door was slightly ajar, and from the dark crack, he could see the glint of something metallic inside. Slowly. Joe approached the closet, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. He swung it open, revealing a small, rusted key hanging from a nail inside the wall. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. He pulled the key down, turning it over in his hand. There was nothing remarkable about it, but as soon as he touched it, the tapping stopped. The next day, Joe and Susan decided to search the house for anything unusual. In the basement, they found an old hidden door covered by layers of dust and cobwebs. It was locked, and the key Joe had found fit perfectly into the keyhole. Reluctantly, Joe turned the key. The door creaked open to reveal a small windowless room. Inside were faded old toys, a broken rocking chair, and a child's drawing scrawled on the wall. The drawing depicted a family, 2 parents, a little girl, and a boy. But the boy's face was scratched out, leaving only a shadowy figure in its place. Joe and Susan stood frozen, the weight of the room's history pressing down on them. As they backed out of the room, they heard the voice. A child's voice. Faint, but clear. "Leave. This is my house." From that moment on, the house's malevolent presence grew stronger. The Morris family was no longer alone. Objects moved on their own, and at night, footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Emma became plagued by nightmares of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. Susan saw dark shapes in the corners of her eyes, always just out of sight. But Ben was the most affected. He stopped speaking to his family altogether, his time consumed by his invisible friend. One night, Joe found him sitting in the middle of the living room, staring into the dark, his eyes empty. "Ben?" Joe called, but his son didn't respond. Suddenly the lights flickered, and a cold gust of air swept through the house. Joe felt a presence behind him, something cold and malevolent. He turned, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness of the old house. In the following days, the family's situation worsened. Ben became more and more distant, as if something was taking him away, little by little. Susan grew terrified, convinced that whatever was haunting the house wanted her son. Desperate for answers, they reached out to a local historian who had studied the house's past. The man confirmed their worst fears. The house was known to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died within its walls, but there was something darker, an entity that had existed long before the DeFeo murders. It fed on the fear of its inhabitants, growing stronger with each passing day. With no other options left, the Morris family fled the house. They left behind everything, furniture, clothes, even their beloved family photos. They just wanted to escape. But as they drove away, Susan glanced into the rearview mirror. There, standing in the window of the house, was a small boy, his face pale and hollow, watching them leave.